Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to welcome you back to the virtual reading group. Happy New Year. We haven't seen you all since 2022. I hope you had a good New Year, and 2023 is starting off well for you. We are continuing to read these essays of Hannah Arendt's that are collected in the book The Jewish Writings, edited by Jerome Cohn and Ron Feldman, both of whom have been joining us periodically, which has been great. The vast majority of these essays, and what we've been doing for the last month or more than a month, took place in the 1940s. So this is a decade in which Arendt arrives in the United States, in New York, lives on Riverside Drive, and begins working largely for Jewish publications, Jewish press, and I think I was just talking to Yana before we let everyone in. It is sort of a reminder of how deeply involved she was in these questions, from the late 1930s and through the 1940s. These essays go through 1948 today, I believe, or 49 even. These were, she hadn't yet published The Origins of Totalitarianism. She hadn't published any book that made her well known. And one of her main jobs and main preoccupations was thinking about engaging in the question of Zionism, and the question of the Jewish question, the Jewish problem, and this is what she was working on. And for those of us who, and I'll put myself in this category, largely read Arendt from The Origins of Totalitarianism forward, which was published in 1950. We know she's involved in Jewish politics. We know she's written some of these big essays, but how involved she is and was, I think, sometimes gets forgotten. And this is, if anything, I hope this has been a reminder of that, and to see, how a really brilliant, thoughtful, stateless refugee, who is, trying to make sense of the Holocaust, and at this point she doesn't know about. Actually, at this point, at this point she knows about the Holocaust, but trying to make sense of the war and the Holocaust and what's happened is sort of extraordinary. The essays we read today, which take us through the end of this section on the 1940s writing, and we'll start next week in the 1950s, are sort of a grab bag of sorts. It starts with two reviews of books. One is about Chaim Weizmann, the who became president of Israel, first president of the state of Israel. And the other is a review of his autobiography, Trial and Error, the autobiography of Chaim Weizmann. What do I want to say about these two short book reviews, which is really what they are? Why did Hannah Arendt write them? Why was she interested? I'm not entirely sure, but she's interested in Chaim Weizmann himself. She thinks of him as not a great man. I think she says he was close to maybe being a great man, but as someone who had an enormous political, practical impact. And in both these essays, what she focuses on is that he was someone who brought his background in chemistry, his background in science, um, into the idea of politics on the same grounds. He was practical and he wanted practical solutions. And his goal was the state of Israel. And when he had certain principles that she thought he would, that he thought would lead to the state of Israel, one was an unshakable faith in England, as she cites on 403. And the other was his idea that all political questions are not only secondary to practical achievements, but are actually solved in the very process of planting and building. And while England in the end was not a key player in the founding of the state of Israel, to his maybe disappointment, she does think that his commitment to this practical idea of planting and building, as we would say today, maybe putting boots on the ground, changing the reality on the ground, putting Jews in Palestine, having them own land, having them be part of the world and the economy there. That was, in her mind, his great political achievement. There's one other thing that's sort of a side note in both of these reviews that I at least wanted to mention, because I think it speaks to some of her more controversial claims later in her life when she talks about race or identity politics or things of that sort. So on page 404, at the end of the review of the collected work about Chaim Weizmann, she says, this paragraph that begins 404, Weizmann's success, probably the greatest achieved by a Jew in our time, is based less upon his rather commonplace political convictions than upon his social gifts, which were very rare. So for those of you who are attentive Arendt readers, you're already seeing in germ format an important distinction that Arendt is going to continue to make in her life between what's called the political and the social, right? He has commonplace political convictions, but he's a rarely gifted social actor. And she continues, his extraordinary sense for atmosphere, right? Atmosphere, the feelings of a culture and of a people, is the secret of his Englishness, as Norman Angell calls it, in addition to fascination and wit. His political influence in England is firmly based on his position in high society, where he was received on equal terms. So here's this outsider Jew who's a chemist, and he becomes part of high society in aristocratic, often anti-Semitic England. In this, and as in other respects, she writes, he could be likened only to Benjamin Disraeli, and it is certainly no accident that both men conquered society by exactly the same weapon. They presented their Jewishness as a sign of distinction and knew how to bear it as such in an aristocratic society founded on distinction by birth. So Weizmann's great talent was to present himself as an exceptional Jew, to present himself as someone who was Jewish and thus different, and yet could also fit in, and not only fit in, but be exceptionally capable in high society. Arendt writes a lot about this in the chapter Jew in Society in Origins of Totalitarianism, how discrimination, social or racial discrimination, can lead to great evils, but also has advantages because it allows the people being discriminated against certain advantages. They can use that discrimination to their advantages. And it's one of the reasons she's going to say that in the end, social discrimination is not as bad as racism, because racism will in the end seek to exclude, kill, enslave the people being subject to racism, whereas discrimination is much more nuanced in her reading and her thinking. It's a complicated point. It's obviously one that is going to be quite controversial. And yet, it's one that I think she carries through up until the 1960s in her essays on violence and others, late 1960s. So it's a view she shares and holds her whole life. That discrimination and prejudice, while they can be bad, are never universally bad and not nearly as dangerous as what you call political racism. So social versus political. So this distinction of hers has obviously been highly criticized, has been contested by many people. I put it out there because I think it's part of her work, and I think it's an important part of her work. And I think you're seeing an early expression of it in both of these reviews. She comes back to it again on page 406 in the second essay on Weizmann. To my mind, the most interesting of these essays that we read for today is this next one called "The Failure of Reason," about someone named Greve Bernadotte of Visburg. I have to admit, before I read this, I had never heard of Greve Bernadotte of Visburg. He was born in 1895, and he was assassinated in Jerusalem in 1948 while on a mission for the United Nations to be a mediator between the Arabs and the Israelis. I'm guessing from the tone of her review or essay, that it was the Israelis who assassinated him, although I'm not 100% sure of that. And if people can correct me on that, I'm happy to be corrected. What Arendt found, I think, fascinating about Bernadotte, is that when he was a pacifist, and that when he had first come to Palestine and his first proposals, he had sought to be a mediator between the Israelis and the Arabs, the Jews and the Arabs. He sought, by the way, this is 2 years right after the foundation of the State of Israel. He had sought to bring them together. And as she says on page 410, his earlier conviction of the existence of a common denominator between the two parties, namely of the realization that they both will ultimately have to live in peace, has given way to a description of how he has striven ceaselessly to find a common basis, has abundantly employed both reason and persuasion, and yet found nowhere any basis for discussion, let alone agreement. This, I think, is a fascinating account. I mean, I think it's one that all of us should be thinking about in contemporary politics, in many areas of our lives. But basically what she's saying here is this pacifist, great, fairly well-known diplomat sent to Israel and Palestine to be a mediator, came in with great hopes that he could get them talking to each other, that he could find some common denominator and find some common basis on which they would live together. And he came to the determination that that was not going to be possible, that these two groups of people simply would not talk to each other in a spirit of mutual understanding, where there was an attempt to find an answer or a solution. And what she says is, this is on 412, that what he came to realize is that the only thing they shared, I mean, this is an extremely interesting statement, right? The only thing they shared was that they believed that only force could decide the conflict, that it was going to come down to force. And Bernadotte, who was a pacifist, came to accept that reality. Came to accept the reality that that there would be no peaceful, rational solution, and that it was only going to be a solution based on force. And thus he came up with an idea that the force should be exercised by the United Nations in a peacekeeping mission, and that the United Nations should be brought in to enforce a peace and base it on certain principles, one of which was a kind of confederation. So you can understand also Arendt's interest in that, given her interest in the idea of federation. What I find fascinating here is Arendt's interest in a figure who believed in persuasion. Arendt, as you know, believed in persuasion. Who believed in reason. Arendt believed in reason. Who believed that in talking with one another, people could find common ground. I mean, I've written a lot about this. Arendt has this great line that she uses in 2 or 3 different essays in the 1960s again, that talking about justice and piety will make the world more just and more pious. She really does believe that if people talk to each other in small Arab-Israeli, local neighborhood councils, in town hall meetings in New England, wherever, she thinks people will find common ground. And yet she also knows that there are some times when that doesn't happen. And she was fascinated, I think, by Bernadotte, who came slowly to the conclusion that there was simply no way to find a persuasive, rational common ground, and that force was the only means necessary. And that he then thought the only way to use force in an ethical way would be have an outside neutral party, the UN. She then writes at the end about how no one believed that the UN or he were an outside neutral party. They couldn't accept that, and they looked for ulterior motives and secret plots everywhere. This is on 413 near the end. What neither the Jews nor the Arabs could understand any longer was that there could exist in our world even one independent man without any prejudices and with no axe to grind, and yet passionately interested in the international state of affairs. I don't know if he had no prejudices. I don't think she would probably stand by that statement, knowing what she writes about everyone having prejudices in other books. But clearly she thought of him as as someone of great integrity who was trying to come up with a solution fairly, and neither side would accept it. So I thought that was an extraordinary essay in that sense. The next essay about collaboration is her responding to an attack by someone named Ben Halpern about her thinking about Judaism and Israel and anti-Semitism. She says, I'm not going to address his personal attacks, but she does want to address his political attacks. And I think it largely rehashes a lot of what we've already read. So I'll unless you have questions about it, I'll skip that for now. The last essay, is the essay that Hannah Arendt wrote for the New York Times as a letter to the editor that was signed by Albert Einstein, Sidney Hook, Seymour Melman, and many others. It's an essay that gets passed around Twitter and the internet quite a bit if you're on those things. It's a reminder of Arendt's again, willingness to take political stands in some senses. It's the cause of it was a visit to the United States by Menachem Begin in 1949, looking to raise money for his Freedom Party. And Arendt, again with Einstein and others, signed a letter, which apparently she wrote, claiming that Menachem Begin's party was a fascist party, and that it should not dupe the American people into thinking that it was a freedom party. And she goes on to make this argument. It's one of the things that she wrote that is brought out regularly by many Jewish leaders to discredit her still on matters of Israel and Jewish questions. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and open it up to questions. These are rich texts with a lot of history in them. I don't claim to be an expert on history of this period, but I'll do my best. And there is always Google, which we can use to solve some of our debates. I see Yana already looked up who did assassinate Bernadotte, and it was part of the Israeli, a Jewish group, the Stern Gang, the Freedom Party, Begin's group. Yeah. So let's. There's different ways to ask questions. You can put them in the chat, as you know. You be respectful. These are complicated issues, and you can also go down to the reactions button and raise your hand. Are there anyone going to get any questions or thoughts on these essays? Not as many as usual.
There's one hand up by John.
Oh, John, go ahead.
Firstly, Happy New Year to you, Roger. There are 2 points that are very interesting to me about these essays. One is that from my experience, that Arendt's devotion and belief in the workings of people on a lower, in small groups, if they talk, they will be, they can come to an accord. And that is really proven to be the case in many instances below the surface in Israeli and Palestinian relations. There are many agreements and groups that work quietly in the community together, and then it gets overwhelmed and undermined by the galactic forces that seem to tear apart the Palestinians and the Israelis. But there is a validity to her assertion that there will be, that small groups working together can work together. And there are, from my experience in the Jewish world, that there are many instances of that, and from time to time, hopes. Right now, of course, it seems to be submerged with what's gone on with Israel and how the far right government of Netanyahu has taken hold. The other thing that I find fascinating that you don't hear much about, and it is timed and associated with Weizmann, is that really without Israel, without Stalin and Russia, there never would have been a state of Israel, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that Stalin, in that period, for whatever his reasons were, was a willing supplier of arms through Czechoslovakia to the state of Israel, and really enabled them to defeat the Arab armies. And it's not a well-known fact, or you don't hear about it very often. One thinks of the United States as being the prime supplier and supporter, but really at that time, the United States kept a distance with the state of Israel. And ironically, Stalin's willingness, for whatever his causes or thoughts was an active supplier of military arms and munitions for Israel, and enabled the state to really exist and come into formation. So I just add those two observations to the essays, which the one other point about that she doesn't make, that I would like to make, is that as regard to Weizmann's concern for the British community, the Brits really were walked away from the state of Israel and the creation. Their big interest was with the Arabs. This was where the oil was. This was their energy policy, and so they Britain really was not a great supporter of the creation of the state of Israel.
Thanks, John. You're right on all three counts. And so on the last one on Britain, that's part of what she's talking about with Chaim Weizmann. They were really, they wanted to, one of the reasons behind the Balfour Declaration in 1917 was, well, one was to encourage Lenin and the Soviet Union to come in on their side, but another was to appeal to the Arabs, and I think that was fairly consistent. On the question of the Soviet Union, you're right. In fact, Arendt, in a number of the essays that we've read in this book, talks about how it was the Soviet Union in many ways that was one of the strongest supporters of the state of Israel at this time, and that's a big part of, and not a big part of me, but she definitely talks about it. And I know we've mentioned it at least in one or two of our discussions about her, clear-eyedness about that. She talks about it as well in the essay we wrote. We talked about just before the new year, to save the Jewish homeland, on page 392, where she says that it quickly became clear that America is no more in a position to fill the bill supporting Israel than the British, and so Soviet Russia is now left as the only power upon which foolish hopes can be pinned. It is remarkable, however, that Russia is the first big brother whom even the Jews do not quite trust. For the first time, a note of cynicism has entered Jewish hopes. So I think, despite the fact that she became enormously critical of Soviet Russia, obviously, and with justification, at this point, when she's largely driven by Zionist issues, she sees Soviet Russia somewhat hopefully at this time. On your first point, and the one that I think to me is quite interesting, both historically but also in present times, her faith in this idea that in small local councils, reality can be faced more so than at a higher level, I think is right. I mean, I think you're right to point to it, and I think she's right about that to a large degree. Again, we talked a lot about this in the last session before the holiday, in that essay to save the Jewish homeland, where she really does probably in this essay more than any other essay she wrote. Maybe parts of On Revolution are an exception, and maybe parts of the postscript or epilogue she wrote to Origins about the Hungarian Revolution would be two other places where she talks about the power of local council governance, and talks about how local self-government and mixed Jewish Arab councils and rural councils on a small scale and as numerous as possible are the only realistic political measures that can eventually lead to the political emancipation of Palestine. I think it's a real skepticism of large-scale politics and a hope that small-scale neighborly conversations can lead to what? On the first hand, a common denominator of reality. And I think this is something that is throughout Arendt's work. There are so many reasons that we find to lie to ourselves, to evade reality, to fit reality into our ideologies or into our interests. And as we get higher up in a political system, that just becomes the incentives to do that become greater, because we represent certain people. We're performing to an audience. Whether you call it virtue signaling or you call it just good old politics or audience democracy, as it's was called by Bernard Manin in his book on representative government. That kind of evasion of reality is a constant in life and in politics. And Arendt has this view, this confidence that in small groups of people talking to each other, they can pierce that evasion of reality. You all know, or many of you know, that the Arendt Center and I have been very interested in this idea of citizen assemblies, right? Citizen juries, bringing average citizens together to talk about politics. And I think from my perspective as someone who reads Arendt, one of the main reasons I'm interested in these citizen assemblies is not necessarily because they'll make the right decisions, although some people think they often will. It's because in the process of talking in small groups, we rededicate ourselves to reality, right? We rededicate ourselves to listening to people we disagree with and trying to come up with a common denominator, which Mr. Bernadotte said could not be found amongst the Israelis and the Palestinians, but maybe on a small scale it could. And so I think your insights, John, that over the last 60 years of the state of Israel, these have been some of the more successful ways of doing politics on a local level as opposed to on the grand political level is right. And one of the things that I've struggled with reading these essays over the last 6 months, and I mean this in the honest way, is Arendt continually says that her political view is more realistic than that of the people who believe in partition, right? She says it's more realistic to assume that Jews and Arabs can get along and come to a common denominator than it is to assume that if you just give one side sovereignty, they will protect the minority rights of the other. That's her claim. In 2020 or 2023, which we're in now, the idea that Jews and Arabs could get along and govern in a confederate government seems so unrealistic, so idealistic. It's hard to credit her with that. And yet the other side of it is clear, that the idea that one side is going to give the other side equal minority rights is also pretty unrealistic. Her view is that the only hope for a kind of meaningful political solution is local people, small scale local people talking to each other. And she thinks of that as a realistic argument. And I find that on the one hand, compelling. And on the other hand, I look at it and say, look, what are the real chances? Maybe I'm here with Bernadotte. Seems like the only thing they agree on is force is going to solve the problem. And if that's the case, maybe you have to figure out which side you're going to support in the struggle of force. And, Arendt never, it's interesting because, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I'll just say one other thing that I've always found interesting. Arendt wrote a lot about war. And she said about war that traditionally war was part of politics. War was what the kind of politics you engaged in when regular politics failed, to cite Clausewitz, right? War is politics by other means. And she took that seriously. But she said one of the problems in the modern era post 1945 is that with nuclear bombs, real war has become impossible. You can have small wars, you can whatever, but you can't have an all-out war because it means nothing to save freedom by destroying the world. And so she says we have a problem, which is that politics has always been about persuasion and reason, but it always had the safety hatch of war. War was an extreme form of politics when regular politics failed. And part of, as I understand her analysis of international relations in the last post-1945 era, is that the advent of nuclear weapons has removed the escape hatch, the safety hatch in international relations. We no longer really, you can fight little wars, but you can't fight a war to win. And as a result, you have all these conflicts that never end, whether it's in Israel, Palestine, or maybe now in Ukraine and Russia, or Azerbaijan and Armenia, or whatever it is, because the idea that one side would do enough to actually destroy the other side could lead to a destruction of the planet, and that's no longer an option. And so one of the problems we have with politics today is that we have no political means to deal with the failure of rational politics. And I don't know, Arendt never articulated her stance, as far as I know, on a response to that problem. But I think she identified that problem in a way no one else had at the time. And still most people are afraid to identify it because it's so scary, right? I mean, maybe you just have to let the sides fight it out. And yet in an age of nuclear weapons, it's very hard to do that. All right. Hannah, sorry, you're up next.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Happy New Year, everyone. Well, I admit I didn't know what we were going to discuss today. I have read those essays, but they're not with me. I'm in someplace else. But I wanted to ask, I've been reading some extremely negatively critical things about Arendt's stance on Zionism. And of course, I don't in any way agree with her on Zionism or on, I think she was in the playground, playing with things while real stuff was happening. And that she really, it was as if there were no consequences for her. But of course, we know there are grave consequences in real life. But I have been reading this article, and I wanted to ask you, Roger, if you've ever heard of somebody called Elhanan Yakira. He's a Tel Aviv, he's an Israeli political scientist, apparently very highly thought of. And I found this article among some papers written in 2006 called Hannah Arendt, the Holocaust and Zionism, a story of a failure. And it's in the journal Israel Studies. And it is just, you know, I just wondered if you had heard of him because, you know, he talks about how she, you know, sort of ultimately arrives philosophically at a universalism versus a Jewish particularism. And that she denigrated the social, and that her political philosophy was one without compassion. A lot of charges, a lot of and actually a lot of things I agree with, but I just it really intense essay. I guess there are billions of them, and I've read a bunch. But he talks about how she really disengaged pretty much from Jewish life, except for the Eichmann trial, from organized Jewish life after the Biltmore Convention, and after she vehemently opposed Ben-Gurion's long-term political program for the establishment of the state. And then it's sort of like, and she became actually famous with she became notorious with the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, but she was also was highly feted as the author of Origins of Totalitarianism, etc. So it's just very interesting, this article, which I'm not through with yet, but it's a very heavy hitting and apparently very widely cited guy about her shortcomings with her political philosophy vis-a-vis Zionism. So I just wondered if you knew about it.
Thanks, Hannah. I don't know that particular article. There was certainly no shortage of criticisms of Arendt on these questions. I think, yeah, I mean, they're all over the place. This may be a very good one, and it may be one of the better ones. I just don't know it.
Okay.
And it's hard to respond because I haven't read it and whatever.
Exactly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't prepared to discuss the other ones, but I was just curious if you had heard of this guy.
I don't think of her as someone who makes an argument for universalism. So I would want to know what he meant by that. Certainly.
They always talk about Jewish particularity versus universalism when it comes with Hannah Arendt.
Yeah, but I don't know what that means.
Poles, and I don't, that she focused on Jewish particularity and then moved on, wanted it to be universalism philosophically.
I would be skeptical of that claim, but
Okay.
I would have to read what he said. I don't know.
Okay.
Your idea that she denigrates the social, another claim you said that he makes. Again, I think the opposite is the case. In fact, I was just talking about that today, is how she talks about Chaim Weizmann as his genius was in the social. And I think most of the criticism that she's subjected to today, at least on questions of race, is that she defends the social against the political as a realm of importance. So again, I'm not entirely sure what he has in mind to say that she denigrates the social.
Okay, well, I shouldn't take up more of your time because
I
understand what she says about race too. I mean, I've not understand it, but I've read some of it, and she just felt that the social should be in the realm of the private. Was my, one of my brief understandings was that the social should be private versus.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the social is, there's three realms. There's the private, social, and public or political. And the social is an in-between realm, which is the realm of society, not of privacy. Anyway, we can get there, but the one thing that you said that this man said, which I think is right, and I think is important for our reading of this book, is that she disengaged from public Jewish life. I mean, if you look at the way this book is structured, we read, I don't know, 40 or 50 pages of works in the 1930s. Then we read 360 pages or 400 pages of her works in the 1940s. The 1950s is going to be all of like 25 pages, right? And it only really comes back with Eichmann in Jerusalem. And so, I think that's something that, as people interested in her work more generally, should ask ourselves, why did that happen? And, one answer is she was engaged in a political debate and she lost. She, after the Biltmore Declaration, we've read 4 or 5 essays about that in this book. She was against it. She wrote Zionism Reconsidered after it. She lost. And one answer to the question is, she said, all right, I'm not going to sit there and become an angry, opponent. That's not going to be my life. She became a supporter of the state of Israel in the sense that she supported it, but she wasn't going to be an active participant in the politics of it. I think I take that to be her attitude. She also, of course, went along and wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism and had another life, which was apart from her writing about Zionism in Israel. So I would say that those are 2 reasons she stopped writing. And I think it's but I think it's, as I opened this discussion today saying, we just read 420 pages of her writings about Zionism and Judaism from 1930 something to 1949. And from 1949 to her death in 1975, she wrote very little about it, almost nothing.
Right.
So she exited the field. And I think what I think is so interesting from there's different reasons to read these texts. One is a biographical understanding of Arendt. Another is intellectually. You see a lot of the foundations of her interest in the social and the political. You see her interests in federalism. You see her interests in politics emerging, and you see how it emerged within a political question. And that's really helpful, I think, if you're going to read Arendt. And if you're interested in the question of Zionism, I think she makes you think.
Yes.
It's not to say, look, she lost that debate. Some people think she was right, and they still fought.
Many people do. Many
Yeah.
people do.
And they continue to push her. She stopped. She's like, look, I lost. I'm done. I'm not going to keep making these arguments.
I think there's been a real resurgence of interest in Arendt precisely because, I hate to say it, there's a big, anti-Zionism is growing ever more. And this is sort of a leading figure in that movement. And, in many ways, she was right about foreseeing what would happen. But I do think that she is a part of her renewed relevance to certain people, or certainly she's been renewed relevance, not that she ever disappeared, but I think there's a very strong interest in her now related to people who object to, how Israel is faring. That's all.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I would say that a lot of those people are not reading her fairly. She was clearly, she wrote Zionism Reconsidered and was against a certain kind of Zionism, but she was a lifelong Zionist up until she was at least involved with and engaged in Zionist questions on a much more nuanced level than I think the current use of her by anti-Zionists
That's interesting.
shows.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the mistakes that's one of the things that's reading these essays has been really helpful on, is to see how engaged and nuanced she was. But yeah, thank you
so much. The other thing, if I can chime in, the other thing that's sort of like been gathering steam, or I don't know how one would say that, but as a thought experiment to speculate whether this situation in Israel is in some way the reason, or one of the reasons why she embraces US federalism, right? Like I'm not sure what that would mean, but I think it's interesting in terms of her passionate embrace of federalism in the US with all of the US's problems, right?
Absolutely.
There's a sort of motivation perhaps that is stemming actually from this kind of failure of the situation in Palestine.
Absolutely.
I fundamentally agree. That's why reading these is so interesting. You see a lot of the roots of her later work, her more theoretical work. So yeah, thanks, Jana. Bob, you're up. Bob, you got to unmute.
Okay. I found it interesting that she admired Weizmann for his practicality. And in her later writings, of course, her conception of politics is more heroic and classic. When I interviewed her, I think it was about 1969 or 70, and I was talking to her about politics as it was practiced in the US, where a great deal of it had to do with economics and with horse trading and so forth. She had no interest in that. Her concept, at least at that time, was again very heroic, and as we've read in her other writings, has to do with the legacy you leave for future generations. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. When I read the stuff about practicality, I did a double take as well. So I appreciate your bringing that out. And my first thought was sort of like what you said, which is, well, okay, is that right? I mean, she's someone who has an idea of politics, which some people say is idealistic or nostalgic or anything but practical. And at the same time, she's someone who has always revered practical people who get things done and who engage in what she calls, in talking about Weizmann, building and seeding or something. I forget exactly what she'd called it. But going out and doing the work of putting the boots on the ground. She has an incredible respect for people who go to town hall meetings and go to local meetings. And so I think that the challenge for us as, interpreters of her work and of her thinking on these questions, Bob, is to take both sides of that seriously and ask, well, what could she have meant? And is this a contradiction? Is this one of those red threads, like she says of Marx, that runs like a contradiction through her own work? Or is this a productive tension? And I would argue that it's much more of a productive tension. I think she has an idea of politics, which is clearly based in doing great deeds so that people see them and witness them and talk about them, and around talking about them, form a polity, find what unites them, find what they agree on, and create a politics, as you expressed it. But she also understands and believes that part of politics is seeing things, talking about them, engaging in discussions. Horse trading, maybe. I don't think she has as much interest in the horse trading as she does in the tilling the land and talking. But I would imagine that, to some extent, even, I mean, she does believe in compromise and she talks a lot about it. That's another word for horse trading. So maybe if we use the word compromise, she'd be more interested in horse trading. I don't know. But I think that her heroic vision of politics, as you expressed it, which is an aesthetic vision, depends upon also everyday people seeing and responding to that heroism and building a common world. And I think those things go together. And I think they can be productively put together. So, what she's saying about Weizmann is that what he helped accomplish, he wanted Britain to recognize the state of Israel. That never happened. I mean, in the sense that Britain was not the prime mover, but by encouraging people to come to Israel and plant crops and build farms and build land, that created a world in which the state of Israel could emerge. And so I think she just, to me, that kind of practical work could also be seen as heroic, insofar as it acts in the world in a way that people react to it. But I think it fits together. I don't think it's in contradiction with her heroism. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about nuts and bolts, simply horse trading and I'll pass this if you pass that, that's not the politics she's interested in. But she is interested in the politics of let's talk to each other and find out what our core common values are and what we agree on and what we see together. That's I think the practicality she's interested in. Is that? I think that's a distinction that makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to you.
Well, I'd have to mull that over. The only other thing I would add is that Bernadotte was a Swede. It's a French name, and it's interesting, of course. After Napoleon was defeated, the victorious Allies installed a French family on the throne of Sweden, and they're still there. But he wasn't the king; he was, a relative.
Okay. So he was relative of Napoleon eventually? No.
No, of the family that was installed by the Allies who defeated Napoleon.
I see. Okay.
On the throne of Sweden. Yeah.
All right. I did not know that. Thank you. Excellent. Chris. Hi.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. This is fantastic. And it's made me think of something that I experienced that demonstrates the idea of people talking, whether in small groups, mid-sized groups, or large groups. And I want to preface this with saying that the distinction between social and political is an odd distinction to me. And it may be clearer why I'm saying that. Back a few years ago, I had the unique opportunity of sitting between two groups of people in Belfast, Northern Ireland, the United Volunteer Forces, which were the alleged Protestants, and the Irish Republican Army. And these two groups were speaking to each other. They weren't throwing bombs. And my question to them is, what the hell happened if you had told me that I'd be sitting between these two groups in peace 20 years ago? I would have told you you were on major drugs. And they said, we started talking to each other. And I turned to Liam, who was the IRA fellow, and he said, we started talking about our children and how we didn't want our children to experience what we had experienced and our parents had experienced before us and their grandparents. And he said, we found common ground. And I turned to Frankie Mitchell and I said, and what was your common ground? And he said, we both realized that the danger to us was Westminster. And then they took me on a tour. I had seen the the murals in the Christian section after I laid roses on the grave of Bobby Sands. And my participation in this whole movement was very strong IRA, very strong. My parents, when I got older, we gave money to the IRA to support weapons being put in the hands of the IRA. And I was on the side I was in Shankill, which is the Protestant side, and I was looking at the murals. And one of the fellows who had been in prison in the maze said to me, "We are re-imaging these murals because we don't want all the violence." And I turned to him and I said, "Don't take all of the violence out. You need to remember what happened." And it's in the Shankill where they have the mural of freedom, where you can write things and you can bring things to the mural. You can paint things on the mural. They have pictures of Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass. It's just amazing. And then they took me to the Women's Center in Belfast, where violence against women was something that was put on the back burner because of the trouble. And I sat there listening to the Protestant women talk to me about the horrors of what the IRA had done to them and their families. And all of a sudden I said, not to my credit, I can't hear anymore because of my leanings with the IRA. And this woman looked at me and she said, "That's exactly my response when my Catholic sisters were telling me what the UVF had done to them." And all of a sudden I had this epiphany and I said, my God, I need to open not only my heart, but my head to hear and to understand what it is you are saying to me. Because what brings both sides together was the pain, the devastation, the death, the destruction that they each had experienced. And I almost died when I was standing in Belfast and there was a parade going on. And I said, "What is this about?" And they said to me, "Oh, this is a parade honoring the Lord Mayor of Belfast." And I said, "Oh, and who is that?" And they mentioned a name and they said, "Oh, he's from the Sinn Féin party." And my mouth just dropped open. Now, granted, they still closed the gate between the Shankill and Fall Road, which is the road that leads in one direction into the Catholic section and one direction into the Protestant section. And I asked Liam and Frankie why, and he said, "Because there are still some among us who will not take responsibility for the violence that has been perpetrated in our names." And that to me, and I said to them, "Have you thought about working with the situation in Palestine and Israel?" And they said, "We have thought about it, but it's so different, and yet I don't see it as so different." And I just wanted to share that because the social was what they experienced on a personal front that then got discussed in terms of the political and the changes that were made. And the changes are enormous. And I don't think that most people are aware of. But to stand in Belfast and to see that and to listen to people who I was opposed to and to hear their pain and understand that what we shared was the common pain. Mine not so much as theirs because I didn't lose anybody. But it was just so profound. So when I see this, the social versus the political, that social discrimination is not as bad as political discrimination, I'm wondering what Arendt meant by that, because I don't see the distinction, unless we're talking about law. That may be the distinction, but also to remember that one, and bringing it to the United States, and then I'll shut up. One of the things that we realized after the Roe versus Wade decision came down, and before the ink was even dry, the local groups that were anti-Roe versus Wade were organizing on a local front, and I mean school boards. And we are seeing the effects of that now. And we have got to do that. We cannot simply look at the elite notion of what the political is. We have to look at the day-to-day interactions that people and groups of people have in this country. And I just wanted to share that. And now I'll be quiet.
First of all, thank you, Chris. That was incredibly powerful statement, and I hazard to even say much in response to it because I thought it was so well said. And obviously, I would like to learn more about the work you've done in Belfast and in Ireland. You know, your basic points of how people on a local level who couldn't see eye to eye over time were able to talk to each other and develop a common understanding and a common world is an extraordinary example. And it's the kind of example that I think gives us hope. Especially in a place like Israel, Palestine, but even in, you know, smaller places like the United States, smaller places where smaller, not quite as deadly right now, disagreements, but certainly strong disagreements. You know, I think what you're describing in Ireland is exactly what Arendt saw as the promise of local councils, neighbor councils, as she calls them, workers' councils, where people had to talk to each other and try and hear more, even when they didn't want to hear more, and force themselves to see a reality that they often had hidden and didn't want to see. So, you know, everything you're saying strikes me as important and right. And like, you know, and it's hard for me to even move on from that to a more technical issue, because I think what you're saying is so powerful and it doesn't need that. But since you asked, I will say that the kind of conversations that you were describing happening in Belfast, Arendt would call political, right? They are conversations not in society, you know, at a party or at a soiree or at a vacation club where you go to be with your family and friends. Those are social engagements where you know, dress up and have a drink and talk to people who are easy to talk to because they share most of your commitments. When you put yourself in a situation where you're with people who don't share your commitments and are not easy to talk to, and you have to talk to them, that's not social, that's not society, that's politics. When I said that she says that social discrimination is less dangerous than political or racial discrimination, what she means simply is that you can be prejudiced against Protestants and rather go to a Catholic school and support Catholic charities and go to Catholic vacation resorts and still believe that Protestants have the right to vote and are human and exist in the public sphere. You just choose not to hang out with them. And you can be fairly prejudiced against Protestants and still believe that. Racism or political discrimination is when you say that Protestants don't have the right to vote or don't have the right to work, or that they have to be imprisoned or killed because they're Protestants. As she says, there's an immense difference between men of romantic prejudicial notions and men of violent deeds. And that's the distinction between the social and the political. You can have social prejudices that, you know, are prejudices, but don't lead to, you know, murder or enslavement or imprisonment or expulsion. They're just prejudices. And we all have those prejudices. Every person has them. And you're never going to get rid of prejudices, but you can challenge them, and you can make them thoughtful, and you can make people see things differently, but you're always going to have prejudices. But you should not have racism. And that's the distinction she makes between racial discrimination, political discrimination, and social discrimination. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes. Thank
Is that all
you
right?
very
Do you
much.
want to respond at all?
Yeah, this is Chris. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, yes, but where I would tend to deviate just a wee bit is that those social interactions that are isolated or within the tribe, okay, for lack of better terminology, will be used as a political weapon. It may not be used by the people themselves in that. It may, but it may not. And that's what I'm seeing now.
Yeah.
That's what I'm seeing now with what I consider to be the amazing tribalization of the American people. And someone said it much better than I could ever say it. Patricia Williams said, "We are the sum of our parts." And there are different moments when one foot in one tribe will have more of an impact than the other parts of who we are, but we are the sum of our parts. And an example to me is that when I was living out west in Colorado, being a lesbian, that was, BFD, but being a Jew, that was key, because it was, I'm from the city, I'm from the Bronx. And I have to tell you, I couldn't believe what I was experiencing as a Jew. Like, just one funny thing, and then I'll be quiet again. I'm in my office, and I had, at the University of Denver, I taught law, and I had a mezuzah on my doorpost. Okay. And one of my colleagues comes in, lovely woman, love her to death. We're sitting there, we're talking, we're having a great time. And she points to the mezuzah and she said, "Beautiful, absolutely gorgeous." And I said, "Well, thank you so much." And she said, "But I just have one question." I said, "Well, go ahead." She goes, "Why do you have a harmonica on your doorpost?" I started dialing the phone and she said, "Who are you calling?" I said, "I'm calling my friends in the Bronx for a one-way ticket to go home." And that's just a funny example, but the examples were profound in terms of what people would feel very comfortable saying. Like in a small group of my students, I said, "So how did the negotiation go?" And one of the guys said, "I did great. I Jewed him down." Oh my God. Okay. All right. And they didn't realize I was Jewish because of the name of Michio, you think I'm Italian Catholic. And that's a very long story. I'm not going to go into it, but it was a big mistake on their part. So now I'm going to be quiet.
Excellent. Thank you. You know, the last 2 weeks, I spent furiously writing a paper on Arendt and prejudice. And I have a draft of it. I'll have to revise it, but I should show it to you, Chris, and get your comments on it, because I think what you're saying, you're talking about examples of prejudice and even examples of discrimination. And Arendt's view is that they can be hurtful and they can be bad, and they can even be, things that cause economic and social and psychological pain. But she thinks that they're fundamentally different from legal, racial, political discrimination. And as someone who suffered through those, she sees a huge difference between them. And she thinks that we should aim to eliminate racism. We should aim to make people thoughtful about prejudices and engage them, but we can't extirpate them. You're never going to get rid of all those prejudices. You can get rid of some, you can change some, you can move them, but we humans are prejudicial beings, and we're always going to be members of certain tribes. And that's her view is that we have to both accept that and also be able to live politically outside of them. And you're right that it's hard, but that's the struggle that she's put herself in. As we're going to be reading a bunch of her stuff on race and prejudice after we're done with this Jewish writings book. So I think in March, we're starting a series of readings on Arendt, race and prejudice. And we will have ample time to discuss these very complicated issues and see what she's trying to say about them. So hope you'll join us for that when we get to those. But thank you, Chris. George.
Okay, just a couple of short points on the discussion here about political versus social. One is in the race and prejudice thing. Maybe I'll wait till we talk about it. But one of the things I just recently read was some very interesting thing about Afro-American writers writing who'd read Arendt very closely, writing about her Little Rock essay, and they mentioned that, and what struck me too, is that Arendt would carry her pariah versus parvenu experiences from Europe and Germany and East European Jews to America and African Americans. And that she would show the prejudice through that particular sense of it, which is a particular feeling of superiority. Again, I don't want to go too deeply into that, but perhaps later on we can discuss that. The other aspect is just very quickly about small groups. And again, something I recently read also by a very savvy biologist, and maybe you want to comment on that, who wrote that one of the good explanations for the origin of complex society is that a lot of people must interact, when other people have to interact with one another on a personal level, it seems to get on their nerves. Egalitarian groups of more than around 30 or 35 people are near the limit of the individual tolerance for complexity, which is the reason for hierarchy. And that's, again, we go little groups, but little groups don't talk about nuclear arms and nuclear wars among each other. It's the little group of the leaders of the US, the China, Russia, etc. And that's a little group that has a lot of problems as well. And also when we talk about representative government in the United States, again, this is a way to try to decrease the complexity of having huge groups of people politically, and that has its own problems too. Now, as you can see now, the House of Representatives in the United States is not exactly representative. Perhaps you want to comment on one of those things.
A lot to comment on, George. You know, on the social question, you know, yes, I mean, I think there's no doubt. I mean, I don't think there's any secret here, and I don't think it's controversial. Hannah Arendt, like every human being, had prejudices. I have prejudices, you have prejudices, we all have prejudices. You know, her prejudices do pop up at times in her writing, in her letters, and in other places. And I don't think she would ever deny that, and I certainly won't deny it. You know, she brought over a sensibility of a German, highly educated German Jew, you know, who'd been persecuted, but also saw herself as having a certain kind of distinction over maybe Eastern European Jews. That said, she was also very critical of many German Jews, and at times, you know, actually held up Eastern European Jews as a model for things that we need to take seriously. So, I mean, more so than I think your typical prejudiced German Jew, she was open to criticizing herself and seeing in the people she was often critical of things she could learn from. But she had prejudices. there's a certain school of Arendt criticism right now, which says, oh, Arendt had prejudices, therefore she was racist, therefore she shouldn't be read. I don't think much of that school of criticism, but it's out there and it's becoming increasingly popularized. And so, I think one should deal with it. On the, yeah, I mean, I don't, on the small group things, I think I agree with most of what you're saying. I think, I'm not sure a small group of diplomats is what she had in mind, but yeah, I'm with you on most of that. So thank you. Is that anything you wanted to folk that I didn't answer, that I didn't respond to, that you really wanted me to, George?
No, you really did. And I think, but it's something to consider. And I think both things, I think the racial thing, we can speak more about later.
Yeah. And by the way, what Helen, talked about, Helen Rubinstein talked about earlier, but, the same thing is happening now with, a lot of young Jewish intellectuals are finding Arendt and embracing her as an anti-Zionist. And a lot of other Jewish people are saying, oh, she was a anti-Zionist, therefore she was a bad Jew and shouldn't be read, or things of that sort. She had prejudices. She had her views. She doesn't hide them. I think they're quite out there. So
the one thing I want to add, really, what you're speaking about is the current cancel culture, which is a totally different problem, or is a different problem.
we'll get there when we talk about the race stuff. So yes, thank you. Gilbert.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like first to pass my greetings to you all by saying Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, and most welcome. Therefore, mine is not a question, but is just a comment. Based on how Arendt described wonderful the word practical solution, the word practical achievement, the word practical ideas, and political achievement. For that reason, I would like to highlight this. If today's politicians could read and access easily her readings in order to gain new skills, our world would be better than before. Thank you. That is my comment.
Well, thank you, Gilbert. I think it's, this brings us back to Bob Meyerson's question earlier and comment earlier about the connection between what she means by practical and what sometimes she means by, more heroic politics or aesthetic politics. But, and I think what you're saying is very much in line with what I was trying to articulate in my response to Bob, but I think you're putting it well, that, we need a politics that's, yes, driven by ideas and ideals, but that in the end remembers that what politics is about the composition of common sense. That's what politics is. A polis, right? A polis is a group of people who are different, who come together around a common interest, Aristotle tells us. And that's what I think Arendt understood politics to be. And so the act of being a politician is the practical act of helping people who are different see what they share in common and what unites them into a polity. Now that doing that requires having an idea, namely the idea of what we share, but it also requires having the practical skill to help people see what it is they share, especially when, as Chris was talking about, they don't want to hear it anymore for whatever reasons. And that very common, in her essay, as her lecture series on Kant's political writings, which we read about a year ago or 2 years ago, some time ago, Arendt is very clear that politics is about wooing people to having shared views and opinions. And that wooing, which, I think of as one of the great technical terms in all of Arendt, is very practical. You have to be able to plant the seeds that make people see what they share, build the world that people share. And so I take that, your comment, Gilbert, to be dead on, and it's so important. And if people could just get beyond their ideologies and their worldviews that separate them from reality and keep them insulated from other opinions, and engage in the practical work of building what they share. And by the way, Corey Robin wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books recently, which I wrote about in the Amor Mundi newsletter, which I assume some of you get and maybe some of you read. But in it, he talked about the return to Marx. I mean, not time, sorry. That's really oh my God, Freudian slip. The return to Smith, Adam Smith, not through his book, The Wealth of Nations, but through his books on moral and ethical sentiments. And what Corey was really, doing, and what a number of really fascinating Smith scholars have been arguing for the last 20 years, in what's really been a fascinating Smith renaissance, is that it's in the act of buying and selling, of barter and trucking, where you negotiate with people and talk to people, that you build a common moral and ethical world. And that what was interesting about Smith's capitalism was not, the invisible hand or the idea of no regulation, because Smith didn't believe in no regulation. He believed you needed regulation. What was interesting was the way in which, in the daily commerce with other people, the practical world, you built a common world. And that practicality, I think, is something Arendt shares. And I think it's a really great point, Gilbert. So thanks for ending us on, I think, a very positive and hopeful note.
Can I just say one thing about the chat function?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to remind people to remain civil in the chat. It can be sometimes exhausting, it can be boring, it can be painful or upsetting or annoying to listen to people. But please don't voice your frustration over individual members in the chat. It's not appropriate. So remain civil, please. I have not read the chat. I don't get to read the chat while I'm doing this. And I want to thank Yana for bringing that out. I will have to go back and look at what happened, but it is absolutely essential that we all treat each other civilly. As we've always said, you can argue with the ideas, but don't attack the person. And so let's all try and keep that in our minds here and in life. Thank you, Yana. Thanks all. Happy New Year again. We will meet next Friday, and we're reading the writings from the 1950s for next Friday. See you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Be well.